Enjoy with your headphones for a better listening experience.
Please watch till the end of the video to have the most scariest part of the story.
Doctors of Reddit, what was the craziest case of patient paranoia that you have ever seen? My father was a doctor, dermatologist. Had a patient who accused him of prescribing a non-existent experimental drug for a supposed condition that he was never diagnosed with. Tried to take him to court and lost. Sent a threatening letter after, reported to police. After the police confronted him about it, he dropped a homemade fruit basket with a single bullet on top of the fruit at the front step of the office, addressed, but not postmarked, to my father with a creepy and signed apology note. Basket was immediately shown to police. About a month later, my father received a letter from the guy stating he had seen my name in the paper sports section, local golf tournament results, and that he knew I would be playing at an upcoming tournament where the start times were published. There was a police presence at the tournament, something that never happens, because my father reported it. My dad's nurse's husband was a local detective and pretty much followed me the whole day with my dad. The police found the guy in the parking lot unarmed and he was arrested, and then eventually committed to a psych hospital for some time. There's still a restraining order against him to this day, but this was over 15 years ago and the guy seems to have disappeared. I didn't know any of this until about 5 years ago, but I remember my dad having a single bullet in his bedside table even though he never owned any guns. When I asked him about it, all he would say was, "Someone gave it to me." I never understood the whole giving someone a bullet thing. I used to be a manager at a nice beach resort, and I remember one morning I had the displeasure of dealing with a real asshole. Long story short, there was one valet on duty and there were two young Asian guys outside, each with a blue BMW. Valet started putting one guy's luggage in the wrong car. One of the Asian guys was chill and laughed it off. The other one went ballistic and kept on telling me to give him a free night or he would give us a terrible review all over social media. I basically told him to get lost because he was being ridiculous, and 5 minutes later the dude paces through the lobby like 3 times, each time dropping a bullet onto the floor. I was like, "Hey man, do we have a problem, so I can call the police?" And he just took off. Weirdest guy ever. I took psych like pretty much every college freshman. My professor was an amazing guy who looked like Jerry Springer. Anyway, he taught part-time because his real job was working with inmates at the state prison that housed the crazies. He told us the story of when he did his internship at Chattahoochee State Hospital. In Ward A, there was this guy who thought he was Jesus. He'd walk around wearing sandals and would bless people. His justification for believing that he was Jesus was that Jesus was a carpenter and he was a construction worker, so close enough. They didn't try too hard to cure him because they weren't so sure he was wrong. In Ward B, there was this guy who thought he was Satan. Satan would curse you and tell you that you were going to burn in your bed, that sort of thing. He was an all-around unpleasant patient. Jesus and Satan found out about each other. Then they kept hanging around the doors to their wards, trying to get to the other so that they could have their own little Armageddon right there in the vestibule. The hospital ended up instituting a policy preventing Ward A and Ward B doors from being open at the same time. Not a doctor, but my grandfather had Lewy body dementia. Unlike other dementia, Lewy body has a strong hallucination component. Here are a few of my favorites. My grandma was having an affair with the pharmacist. She was also running a whore house, which would be okay, but she wouldn't give him a cut. The shadow men had built an exact replica of his house, but on wheels, to use as a brothel, naturally, and were stealing his electricity to power it. That's why his switches, which powered outlets, would flip and nothing would happen. They had also dug in a basement under his house which he attempted to access one night by cutting a hole in the floor with an axe. If he took anyone looking for this alternate house, they would move it to make him look crazy. The staff at the care home he eventually was placed in was treating all the food with embalming fluid, so he couldn't eat it. He also had another doctor tell him that the medications he was on were poisoning him and that he didn't need to take them anymore. It was a roller coaster. My dad was diagnosed with early-onset LBD about a year and a half ago. I feel your pain very deeply, as stories like this are what I live when I'm home with him. He thinks our house is a hotel, and the people outside keep looking into the house at him, but will never talk to him when he confronts them. He's talked about the floating people, hanging in the corners of rooms and in his closet. They're actually coat racks and his clothes on hangers. He has hallucinations of things that happened when he was in the military, and when he worked for a local sheriff's department. One time, he locked my mom, his primary caregiver, out of their room until the morning, saying she's delusional if she can't see the other people in the room and threatening to call 911 for them to do a mental health evaluation on her. I woke up late that morning. My mom was drinking coffee and was very tired as she told me this. As if on cue, my dad threw the door to their room open. My mom and I both looked over to see him standing in the doorway, but naked, saying, "Honey? I could use a little help." I covered my eyes and my mom said, "You need to put some clothes on, you're naked." He yelled back, "I am not." And then he looked down and saw his junk, and I kid you not, channeling all of his inner Josh Peck, said, "Oh, I am," and slammed the door. We couldn't help but laugh, haha. I have so many more stories of the things he's talked about. Mostly, though, I can't help but believe that his life is a living, literal nightmare. He started getting to the point where he'll forget who me and my mom are for extended periods of time that we can't snap him out of. He turned 60 this year. I miss who my dad was every day. And I sure as hell hope this isn't hereditary. Not a doctor, but I work with elderly people prone to delirium. We once had an 80-year-old academic at our institute. I think he was some sort of professor and obviously well-spoken, also mostly appeared to be very lucid at first glance. For months, he'd harbored the idea that he was at the center of an elaborate ritual conducted by a medieval sort of witch. Because of her spells, he would constantly phase in and out of consciousness, imagining smoking a pipe and talk to people that weren't there at all, etc. He further claimed that he had found that there were pentagrams drawn in lemon juice and goat urine all over his apartment. His mouth was constantly deathly dry, because she would fill it with the ashes of cursed scrolls and parchment. The witch planned to extract something from his body to create a flying ointment or something for her broomstick. Anyways, it was absolutely wild and nonsensical. The crazy thing was, his delusions turned out to be warranted. It was later found that his granddaughter for months had actually tried to poison him with incrementally increasing doses of belladonna extract. Student nurse here, but I still go to the hospital for internships. Had a patient come to the ER with really high blood sugar, type 2 diabetic. I asked her if she was taking her medications and she said that she didn't want to. Thinking she was referring to some type of bad side effect, I asked her what medication she was taking and it was diabetes, chlorpropamide for those of you who aren't Brazilian, pretty standard DM2 medication, not a lot of bad side effects other than some skin rashes. I asked her why she wasn't taking the pills and she said, "Look at the name, I can't take something that has Diablo, devil in Portuguese, in the title. If I have to go, I shall go without any contact with these devilish chemicals, like the Lord intended." It was hard not to laugh at that one, but I kept my shit together. Not a doctor, but I used to go to a nursing home to visit with people. I had an elderly lady call me her grandchild. That wasn't uncommon even for those who were completely lucid. I had many grandmas and grandpas and she was my favorite. She was very sweet and funny. She seemed to only have the occasional lapse of memory, at least that's what I thought. One day I was in her room watering her flowers. She asked me how I really was. I said fine, but she then whispered, "I don't think they can hear us, unless there's some device in the flowers brought." I was confused but said, "Nope, I'm fine." She loudly said my real name and that she was happy to see me. Then she grabbed my arm and pulled me in and called me Anna, not my name, and said she could get me safe. Then went on this whole thing about them capturing me and bleaching my skin. Now she was black, I'm white. She asked if my skin was burning and not to worry because I wasn't patchy, so I could pass for a white woman and that I could still get a husband. She was worried about my children, which I didn't have any. She gave me crackers because she was worried that I didn't have food. I don't know if she had been stockpiling them for a reason, but they were the kind they occasionally got with dinner. I honestly didn't know how to respond. I was 15 and very confused. I think I smiled and tried to tell her I was safe. It was a very weird and sad at the same time. I'm not sure what she went through in life, so it could have been some kind of memory. Anyway, after that day she would occasionally call me Anna, give me crackers, and ask if I was safe. Most of the time she would call me by my real name, until about 6 months before she passed, and then she really didn't recognize me at all. I'm in dermatology. There are a lot of people who think they have bugs in their skin. A lot of them aren't crazy, but there is also no bugs. Often it will start with a splinter or a bug bite and they get this idea of bugs in their skin they can't shake. Once we explain it to them and give them something to calm their peripheral nervous system, they usually do well. That said, there are also very crazy people who think they have bugs in their skin. They will bring us bags of scabs or jars of pee so we can examine them for bugs. One guy thought he had glass in his skin and brought in a whole duffel bag of Gatorade bottles filled with urine. Those cases are really sad because even though we try to refer them for the help they need, they usually just yell at us/post a bad review and never come back. One lady used to beg us to cut open her fingers to look for them. Usually these patients will look like meth heads because they've just picked at themselves obsessively. Most of them are safely, guess are not, but it's a sad thing to see either way. Also sometimes they have scabies and just thinking that word makes me itch. One of my close family members is a doctor. A lady came in with her infant, 0 to 12 months, indicating that the government was going to take her baby away if said infant didn't get the heart surgery the baby needed, because they would think she was neglecting it. She had visible signs of self-inflicted injury and, I forget the name of it, but the one where people rip out clumps of their own hair and eat it. My family member treated the baby. When I say treated, I mean, they did the rundown on the baby and verified that it was in good health. Social workers were called with respect to whether there were any orders out or issues regarding the welfare of the kid, and, nothing, the kid wasn't on anyone's radar for social services, or any of that. Then things get interesting. Police show up. Husband had called the police and said wife was acting erratically on the phone, but when he got home, she and baby were not there. I gather police protocol normally involves checking hospital admissions so people get found quickly. Wife subsequently failed, both with officers and physicians present, to correctly identify day of the week and current location. I'm going to omit the whole after story, but the end of the story is just that a couple months later, husband, baby, and wife/mother are all happy/healthy, and it's about as positive of an ending as an acute mental health incident can have, given the circumstances. I have been diagnosed with schizoaffective disorder, which is like schizophrenia and depression in one, and I have had many delusions like this. At one time I thought my family had been replaced with clones and were out to get me. I thought they had hidden recording devices in my house and were watching me at all times. I also once thought that North Korea was planning on dropping nuclear bombs that would destroy the whole Earth, and I was the only one that could stop it by, for some ungodly reason, setting myself on fire. It's embarrassing to think back to those times. I hope you don't have to go through that again, as I know how scary it can be. I am not a doctor, on my way to become one though. Last year I was volunteering at this hospital and one of the doctors asked me to change the floor of one of the patients. For some reason, the floor bag had a bright red tag with a caution sign on it. It was just glucose and vitamins and shit. Anyways, as I was putting the bag up, the patient started screaming that I wanted to poison her and that she knew what I was doing. She kept telling everyone I was trying to kill her and screaming until she woke almost the entire floor. I felt so embarrassed while having to explain what happened to the doctors that came rushing in. They thought she was having a heart attack. After it all blew over, the patient refused to let me do anything to her, and whenever I came in the salon for other patients she was glaring at me. Her poor husband bought me a big bouquet of roses the next day. This middle-aged lady had a pituitary, brain, mass that had gotten large enough to push on her optic chiasm, the place where your optic nerves cross over each other between your brain and your eyes. She was totally blind because of this before she decided to seek care. She had her brain mass resected and was on a bunch of steroids to replace her pituitary function. The steroids, plus the ICU environment / lack of good sleep, plus the recent brain poking led her to become absolutely psychotically delirious. She was extremely paranoid, to the point of mistrusting everyone who came into her room. This included her family, who, since she couldn't see them, she accused of being imposters who were working for the hospital to try and trick her. One day my whole team was at a conference and got a frantic page from her nurse. We rushed back to the ICU to find the patient, fully naked, perched on the side of her bed, remember, bowling, about to do some sort of WWE-type jump attack in the nurse's general direction. We managed to subdue her with some Haldol, and after a few more days she started to clear up, but I'll never forget that image of that big nude Pacific Islander lady teetering on the edge of the bed. I worked in a care home as a cleaner for a while. Yep, you guessed it, not a doctor, and basically, ground floor was for the regular and manageable old folks, and the second floor was for the more difficult residents. So I and the other cleaner on shifts would swap floors daily. One day she would do floor 2 while I did ground, and the next I would do 2 and she would do ground. There was one resident, Maggie, and I'll never forget Maggie. On our first day, we were warned that Maggie was suffering from either Alzheimer's or dementia, can't remember which, but she had a tendency to be mean, nasty, and sometimes very aggressive and would attempt to get physical. If we felt uncomfortable, we could do the clean of her room, while the carers attended to her. Now Maggie was fine with me. Apparently a rarity. She had her favorites in the home and only allowed certain carers to do their jobs, and me the cleaner. On floor 2, was where the cafeteria was and where staff could go to get a drink. So this day I'm on ground and the other cleaner was on 2. I finished doing what I was doing and made my way upstairs to get a drink for my break. As I pass Maggie's room, I hear a commotion, so I do the knock and walk to make sure everything was okay. When bam, a fresh cup of hot tea smashed 2 inches away from my head and Maggie shouting, "Get her out. She is Satan in disguise. She's trying to suck my soul up and I'm not ready." The other cleaner cowering by Maggie's bed with a vacuum in hand and an arm covering her head from the onslaught of boiled sweets and whatever else Maggie could get her hands on. I took over and finished vacuuming the room, and Maggie expressing how I was clearly Gabriel in female form because I saved her from the grasp of the devil. She even asked if she could touch my wings so she would be blessed and absolved of sin before she died. From then on, I and the other cleaner swapped a room each. The room I decided to swap was with a guy with a penchant for younger girls, I was 18 at the time and the other cleaner was in her 50s, so it made sense, who would always try and grab my arse. Not that he ever succeeded, but the attempts always made me feel uncomfortable. There was another guy in floor 2 who used to smear his shit everywhere to protect from the evils of women and would also masturbate furiously using his own shit as lube. Not a doctor, but late last year my father came to get me and my sister at my mom's place. It seemed like something was wrong and my mom and stepdad talked with him for a bit, and after like 10 minutes, he started telling stories about how he thought that the current job he had him under surveillance. He wouldn't talk over the phone in his car as he thought they were listening. And generally just thought that everyone were against him and tried to take him out or something. It didn't get better for like a week, so we sent him to a psychiatric hospital. First he thought that the nurses and professionals were after him. They gave him some pills, he is still on them, and slowly it got better. After many years of too long stressful hours at his workplace, he had a full-blown stress outbreak. He would cry over everything and nothing. He had so much paranoia it was kind of scary to be around him when he said the things he did. Not a road, but my brother has been in and out of psych wards for the past 10+ years. A more positive delusion he had was that he thought that he was the incarnation of the sun god Ra, which then took a negative turn a couple weeks later as he was convinced that he died every night to be reborn in the morning, and he said this was a painful process. Then he was convinced that the FBI was after him because he had broken through the time continuum and they didn't want him divulging any secrets. The list goes on and on. At one point he didn't recognize me or my mother or anyone else in the family and thought we were random people trying to keep him locked up so he couldn't show the world the truth. It's sad and scary to see someone you love repeatedly go through that. Mental illness isn't something I would wish on my worst enemy. My mom was a supervisor in a nursing home at the time, but she would help during the daily activities with the dementia patients. After they had finished that day's activity and they started to go back to their rooms, one little old lady is screaming at the top of her lungs. My mom rushed to her asking what's wrong, what did she need. This lady explains how someone behind the food counter is beating a dog and she hears it howling. My mom is confused because nobody is beating a dog anywhere and nobody is behind the food counter. So she goes behind the counter and mouths some random words. The lady had hearing problems, and points at the door for this man to leave. My mom then walks over to the lady to calm her down because she is crying at this point. The lady tells my mom to help the dog, so she pretends to pick up this dog and bring him out of the room. My mom then brings the lady to her room and helps her in bed, and she is still upset about it. My mom asks all these questions about if she's okay and what did the dog look like. If she had any dogs when she was younger to try and get her in a better mood. Nothing worked. The lady said the dog was a golden retriever, and so as it happened we had 2 golden retrievers at home. So she got a call from the night supervisor that this lady can't sleep and all she wants is the dog to be okay and happy. So my mom calls to head director of the nursing home if she can bring in one of our golden retrievers to comfort this lady after a sleepless night, and the head director said no. After a few nights, if she can't sleep she'll think about my mom bringing in a dog, most likely not because of health risks to patients. After a few sleepless nights of thus poor lady, my mom is allowed to bring in our dog and hangs out with this lady the whole day, and she is so happy the entire day, and she said she hasn't had that good of a sleep after that day in forever. Whenever I think about this story it gets me so happy. I have a friend who's a doctor and this happened to him. One time a patient came to the hospital wanting pain medications. The thing is, this patient was apparently well known as a drug seeker, and they were able to check to see that he had been given a bunch of prescriptions for opiate painkillers from various hospitals in the area over the last several weeks. Because of that, and all the past tests showing they had basically ruled out everything it could have been, they offered him ibuprofen only and was about to send him on his way. That's when the patient accused them of purposely not treating him and then not so subtly mentioned he knew what car my friend was driving and to watch his back. As soon as he left the ER, the cops were waiting to arrest him. The other scary part was that there was supposedly an accomplice as well that was waiting in the parking lot who fled when all this went down. Don't know if he was caught though. I have an uncle who's a doctor in Kentucky. He gets regular patients who are intensely paranoid. They are obsessed with open carrying a gun on their hip, for what they say is self-defense. No matter how much you tell them that the rest of the world lives fine with the same risk, it makes no difference to them. Oftentimes they own numerous guns and stockpile ammunition. Most of them also mumble incoherent statements about the Constitution and the Second Amendment, which they pretend to deeply care about in order to justify their insanity. Bizarre. My sister came to visit me in Vietnam years ago. She was so excited. She and her daughter had never traveled internationally before, so she decided to splurge and got 30-day disposable contacts so she would be mucking about with her daily disposables or her glasses the whole trip. I had already test-run epic touristy things for her to do, machine guns, elephants, monkey parks, ostrich racing, you know, normal stuff. She tried the contacts out for 2 months before coming so she'd be used to them and put a fresh pair in the day she flew. She showed up bleary-eyed and jet-lagged, but so was her daughter. We had epic trips each day and they were both exhausted and out like lights by 6 p.m. But that one I got worse. By the 4th or 5th day it was puss-crusted and nasty looking. My sister finally fessed up a contact was stuck in her eye and infected. She showed me where it was, and when she grabbed it with 2 fingertips and pulled, it was stuck fast and wouldn't come out. So we went to my doctor and explained the situation. She poked around for a bit and said, "Nope, no contact. It must have fallen out a few days ago because it looks like you've been yanking on your cornea." Yup, my poor sister, so excited and so paranoid, had been grabbing the actual cornea of her own eye in her 2 fingers and trying to pull it off her own eyeball until it got infected. Behavioral health technician of 9 years here. I've seen plenty of patients with acute paranoia, but the one that always sticks to me is a young guy we had about 5 years ago. Guy was about 19, normal-looking white male that had never had any previous mental health history. He was brought in after cutting his own right arm off just below the shoulder. He was the most friendly and loving patient. Always cheerful, talking with all the other patients on the unit, helping people and always saying kind things. He had just entered college and had his first schizophrenic break. Apparently he had become acting more strange to his family, saying weird things, having strange behaviors, and his dad and brother found him in the garage lying on the floor after cutting his arm off with his dad's table saw. The patient had a tattoo above his elbow on his right arm that he said had become possessed with Satan and was telling him to do harmful things to his family, so he cut it off. Still, I hate to this day. Kid was so bright and full of love, and he's born with a disorder like this. Mental health is brutal and a lot of us take it for granted. It was one of those moments when you realize how blessed you are and go home and hug your family. I worked in mental health. We had a mental health case that spectacularly stood out. He was Ivy League educated, and smart as hell. Per his account, when he was a child, he had a friend was a boy, who wanted to be a girl. He was too young for gender reassignment. Our patient reportedly suggested that he just cut it off himself, and that it would force a proper medical response to reassign his gender. Apparently, one day he saw an ambulance next door, and he never saw his friend again. Fast forward a few decades. Our man becomes obsessed with a famous national talk show hostess. He believes she was his best childhood friend next door. He starts writing her letters, many letters. These were as crazy as you might assume, given the backstory. This talk show host ignores them, though somehow this was escalated to the FBI on her end. Our man does not give up easily. He takes it upon himself to fly out to NYC to see her in person, and begin stalking her. To determine if his friend was born male, our guy goes so far as to dress up as a woman, and stalk her at her private health club, hoping to catch a glimpse of her in the locker room. This behavior was far too threatening and bizarre, and it resulted in his arrest, and subsequent mental health treatment. He was still affected by this belief when we received him, even though he had been incarcerated and hospitalized for months. What was so strange is how unique he was. I worked with countless paranoid schizophrenic patients. But this man had one singular delusion, and was otherwise wholly normal. But this belief was so powerful that it drove him to extremes. Not a doctor, but I work in an electronics store. A lady comes in every now and then. She's always struck me as kind of odd. Small store with a lot of the same customers, she obviously suffers from some degree of anxiety, because she is very reluctant to speak, and ask for help. I try my best to help her every time she comes in. One day, she wants to send her phone to service/repairs because she believed that the neighbors were tracking her and listening in on her phone calls, and also reading her messages. She knew that, because there were voices in the phone that told her so. I and my coworkers were a little weirded out. I've heard her mention something like this before, so I wasn't too shook, but we sent it in because no matter what we said she wanted to. A couple of weeks go by, the phone is back and she borrowed a phone from us meanwhile. When she came to get it, she was very worried because there were voices in the phone he borrowed too. We've sent the phone in for her 2 more times after that. She still wants to send it in. Probably paranoid schizophrenia or something. I feel bad for her. There was also this man who jumped around because he felt ants on him, and then proceeded to smell my hair, but he's not paranoid. Just weird, funny, and a real character. As a psychiatrist by training, I don't even know where to start. I had an older woman, sharp as a tack when you'd speak to her, but was so paranoid in her psychosis. She thought that an old associate of hers was working for the mafia and had implanted a listening device into her ear that could also send her messages. Her family members described her house as a fortress because she had installed so many locks and alarm systems, and covered all the electronics with foil. She eventually wouldn't go into more and more rooms in her home, thinking they were compromised and bugged in the drywall. Eventually she was found lying outside her home in freezing temperatures because she refused to go inside. That's what led her to the psychiatric unit. Ultimately, because she was so paranoid, she wouldn't take any meds and eventually became homeless because she refused to live in her perfectly good house. I've also had several patients that have had to be placed on forced antipsychotics because they were so paranoid that they weren't eating and drinking, believing that it was poisoned, along with the medications. Paranoia is my bread and butter. Not a doctor, but a caregiver at a care home. One of our patients, a sweet lady, about 90 years old, let's call her Lisa, has severe paranoia and dementia. But one time beat it all. I was working alone in our department, 8 patients, while my colleague had his dinner break. I was serving a few other patients some night snacks and tea when I hear Lisa scream. It was blood freezing. I and my colleague had put her to bed about half an hour earlier. Lisa lives furthers down in the corridor, approximately 3 rooms away. With closed doors and everything. I put down the last cup of coffee and pretty much run to Lisa's room, knock on the door, unlock it and walk in. She's facing the window, blinds pulled down, and screaming her lungs out. I call her name and quickly start talking to her. As mentioned, she got bad dementia, really bad. She's on and on about some man in the window staring at her. I get up multiple times to assure her that there is no one there. She eventually calms down, but I stay and hold her hand till she falls asleep. This itself multiple times during the night. Eventually my colleague calls the nurse on duty to ask for permission to give Lisa another sleeping pill, as her screaming wakes up the neighboring patients. Just a note, caretakers don't have the authority to make decisions regarding medicine without consulting a nurse or doctor. It was really crazy that night, and unfortunately, that man in the window is the only thing consistent in Lisa's head. I don't know what to make of it. But I'm fairly new to the job and I probably have a lot more to experience. Not a doctor but an EMT. Responded to a call for a patient with altered mental status and paranoia. This patient was in the holding cells at the local train station. Apparently he was causing a scene on the train. Threatening other passengers, saying he was going to kill himself, hallucinating, etc. We walk into the police station there and talk to the 10-ish police around his cell. He's the only person in any of the cells there. We find out that he was in possession of many street drugs and way too many prescription drugs. We make patient contact and start asking him what's going on. He's all calm and collected. Keep in mind that it's me, my partner, and this patient in this 6x8 cell with the patient handcuffed to the wall. We need his arms out of the cuffs for obvious reasons, so one of the officers steps into the cell, unsnuffs the dude, and closes the door with us four in there. Of course at this point I'm scared shitless because I know so many things can go wrong right about now. So we contribute with our general assessment and run a set of vitals on him. Everything checks out great other than this dude being incredibly high on everything he had. So we turn around and start talking to the officers that he is completely fine and can be transported by them to the police station not too far away. The cop had handcuffed him back to the cell at this point. Also, this guy was being incredibly nice to us the entire time by saying, of course, sir, when asked to do things, and thank you so much, after we took his vitals. Then things took a turn. He starts trying to break out of the cuffs and starts barking at us and speaking whatever language he had just made up in his head. Looks me dead in the eyes and says, and I quote, "Say God in your head right now. Do it. I'm an Illuminate assassin. I promise you that God will kill you by morning." Then he starts crying. I had to walk away, I was laughing so hard. This dude kept on screaming things like that until we finally left the station. But after we got back to our ambulance we saw PD carrying him to the car because he wouldn't comply. That was a wild start to a shift. I'm not a doctor nor majored in the medical field, but I did some training as a nurse at a hospital to learn how to take care of my dad. One day, it was a week before I finished my training, an old lady came in the hospital and was being completely hysterical. She was in her 70s. As she walked in she was knocking stuff down and flailing her arms around. When staff gathered around her, they couldn't figure out what was wrong with her as she was just shouting and basically threw herself on one of the staff members the moment they showed up. I was assisting with very basic stuff in the room they took her in, and even though the doctor was calmly asking her questions to figure out what is going on with her, she kept on shouting, talking very fast while crying. Now I was worried, the doctor was worried, and probably all the people in the waiting lobby were too. After calming her down she started talking about how her hair was falling and it was because, as she believed, from her getting cancer and that she was going to die soon. As the doctor explained to her that that's not how cancer works, her face turned 180 degrees and just went very quiet. The doctor did run few tests on her because he was still worried about her. But after talking with the staff there, they all told me that they've seen dramatic people come in the hospital but those had actual issues and they've never seen someone make such a fuss because they thought they had something. I remember going to a rehabilitation center as well as psychiatric, and I met this 14-year-old who thought he had superpowers. He would say how he could move objects, make things levitate, etc. One day, I heard him screaming down the hall at 5 a.m. saying how he was becoming God and how he would have to execute everyone in the building or else he would die. Apparently a nurse attempted to come in and restrain him, but he scratched and clawed the hell out of her. He was given a shot to calm him down, and when he woke up, he acted like nothing happened. He was fine after that. It was super weird and scary as hell. Not a doctor, but I worked in a psychiatric facility for some time. We had this patient who thought she was the Messiah. She didn't trust the staff and doctors at first because she thought they were Jews trying to prevent her from bringing peace to the world, something about the Jews killing Jesus and every prophet God sent. According to her, she was married to Jesus, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, but not to God, the Father. Apparently, it's incestuous to sleep with the Father and Son at the same time. She was not violent, but she refused anyone sharing a room with her. The Holy Ghost would visit her every night and they would have funny time together. She refused to attend to her husband while someone is watching them. She talked a lot about how she had billions of angels at her disposal. And how she had plans to make them build a city in the ocean. Apparently, Jews can't swim, so they will not be able to get into her city. I had one dangerous patient who I was treating at a mental hospital on a remote island. The patient faced a lot of trauma due to the death of their family, resulting in extreme paranoia. Before the patient was traumatized, they were a U.S. Marshal. On the island, the patient thought they were still a marshal trying to solve the mystery of a different lost patient. My assistant and I devised an elaborate game for the patient so that they could live out their fantasy. In this game, the patient believed they were still a marshal in order for them to discover that they were just another traumatized patient so that they could begin the road to recovery. Last week we had a patient who thought he was Jesus Christ. He had a huge Bible and did a bit of preaching in the hallway, but mostly just wandered the hallways in his suit and tie. My floor has a lot of psych patients on it when they need medical attention, but we aren't a psych unit, so we just let him do his thing as long as we didn't find him in another patient's room trying to heal them or anything. We didn't. He was doing Michael Jackson dances in his room for a while, and attempting one-armed push-ups in his doorway in the morning. Mostly we just cracked jokes all night about finding Jesus. As a clarification, Jesus didn't take his insulin and was on my floor because he was in DKA. Otherwise, we have a lot of people who think we kidnapped them because they are so delirious.
Thanks for watching. Please comment, like, share and subscribe. The Internet Surfer on YouTube for more horror and scary stories.